You were talking before about systemic racism being present across Canada and within its institutions. I'd like to ask you specifically, do you think systemic racism is an issue within the RCMP? And if it is, how do you root it out?
Okay. Systemic racism is an issue right across the country in all our institutions, including in all our police forces, including in the RCMP. That's what systemic racism is. It's not, in many cases, it's not deliberate, it's not intentional, it's not aggressive individual acts of racism, although those obviously exist. It is recognizing that the systems we have built over the past generations have not always treated people of racialized backgrounds, of Indigenous backgrounds, fairly through the very construction of the systems that exist. That's why it's so difficult to address, because it does require us to look at the very building blocks of our institutions and of our country and saying, okay, this outcome isn't quite fair. We're not quite bringing in or creating enough success for everyone. That people of privilege have an easier time than people who face discrimination. So it's a difficult and even an uncomfortable conversation. And there are people who highlight that, well, it's painting all our institutions with a negative brush, and it's not being proud of the Canada that we've built and that our ancestors have built. Nonsense. Canadian exceptionalism isn't thinking that we're the best. It's knowing that we could be. It's knowing that this country remains a work in progress, that we can and we must do better. So as much as we admire and support the RCMP, we know we need to do better. And it's not just the individual examples we've seen. It's the issues faced by Canadians of diverse backgrounds over years, decades, and generations. This is a moment where Canadians are recognizing that there is unfairness built into our system, that is always unfair, seemingly, towards the same groups of people. And that's what we have to tackle together. But that's what I know Canadians want to tackle together.
Systemic racism exists across Canada, in all corners of the country, in all our institutions. And it's not deliberate very often, and it's not aggressive and racist discrimination acts. It's the fact that we have systems that were created in such a way as to disadvantage certain individuals, or systems where more privilege is accorded to the majority. And it's not easy to recognize that the institutions that we love, that we admire, like the RCMP, are facing these systemic problems. But it's not the fault of any particular individual now. It's the result of processes that have existed for a long, long time. But it's the responsibility of all individuals who now find themselves linked to these institutions and this country to recognize the system of unfairness and inequality and privilege for some, privilege for some and disadvantages for others that are deeply integrated into our system. And the majority, we often don't see it. We don't see this discrimination and these disadvantages that happen regularly to people, to Black people, to Indigenous people and other minorities. But just because we don't see it does not mean that it doesn't exist. And that's why we need to listen and hear the experiences from those who do live with this discrimination. And we need to commit to look at our systems and try to understand this inequality that's built into the system to establish balance and improve chances for everyone in this country.
Hello, Prime Minister. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. You just said that you have confidence in Commissioner Lucky to do the work, but why should Canadians have confidence that the Commissioner is the right person to bring lasting change to the RCMP when she's contradicting what you said on systemic racism and when her Deputy Commissioner in Alberta does not believe that systemic racism exists within the RCMP?
I think the challenge with systemic racism and systemic discrimination is that it's very hard for people in these systems, particularly people who believe in these systems and are working to make these systems always better, to recognize the extent and the challenge that we're facing. There are good people across this country who try to do better, who try to, serve in the best possible ways, who simply can't see and haven't been able to see that our system itself disadvantages certain communities. And it's hard to create systemic change. That phrase, the system's not broken, it was made this way, is a very difficult thing for people within positions of authority, within systems, to recognize. It's difficult for me as the Prime Minister to recognize that the Government of Canada is regularly guilty of systemic discrimination. It is enough of a big system that has gone on for so long, that has been created in so many ways, that we know that there are unfairnesses in our systems. It's just really hard to change. And what it takes is a recognition and a desire to make these changes. That's exactly what we need to start doing as a country, to not get defensive about the fact that we're not perfect and our systems are not perfect, but say, okay, we recognize that things aren't perfect, and that's why we're going to work very hard to listen, to learn, to understand, and to fix, and to take real action. And that's something that is difficult, but it's something we're going to do together.
I think that it's extremely important to recognize that systemic discrimination exists within our institutions across the country. Even myself as Prime Minister, it is hard for me to acknowledge that even my government, which tries to be progressive and open and defend minorities, is guilty of systemic discrimination. Because it's built into our systems and our structures. And it's difficult to bring profound change, to recognize not that the system is broken, but that it was built this way, unequal for certain groups. And so to commit honestly to look at this and to be willing to change, this is difficult. For sure, it's going to cause problems. We've seen across the country people with an enormous amount of difficulty to even recognize that our systems don't treat everyone the same way and fairly. But this is exactly what we need to do to change it.